here we go, and I'm doing Dirk Pereboom, whom I hadn't really met until we got together here, but read his work, and was fascinated to read what he sent along in this case to discover how close his view is to mine in many regards. And so I'll get to that, but okay. We're starting with Dirk partly because I wanted to be the one to try to give an example of the sort of introduction that would be appropriate. I'm going to see, okay, it's 20 minutes of right now. And also because Dirk is the only one here who sent, no, that's not quite true, Pat as well. I would say who sent work both on consciousness and on free will.
Oh, me too.
So you did, all right.
Jesse.
So Jesse did as well. So you did, I'm sorry, well, I take that back then. Okay, but anyway, Dirk has major messages about both consciousness and free will. The consciousness message is a defense of physicalism against David Chalmers, among others, via the open possibility that introspective representations represent mental properties as having features they actually lack, which you will recognize is a close kin, at least, to Keith Frankish's idea as well. So that's going to be a topic that will be. And on free will, here's my simple version of it. We don't have the kind of free will that is required for what Dirk calls basic desert, but that's okay. We can live fine just without it. Now, those are both theses that I agree with. And so the question then is, did we arrive at them by the same or different method? And the answer is quite different methods, different routes using different methods, which interests me because is this convergence on the truth? If this were science, we would be very happy with this. I think philosophers should too, because if you arrive by different paths to the same destination, that's some sign that you might actually both be right. Or is one method better than the other? And in the end, it's this methodological question that I hope we get a chance to talk about. So let's look at consciousness first and what he calls the Qualitative Inaccuracy Hypothesis, or QI. Introspection represents phenomenal properties as having certain characteristic qualitative natures. Now, let me back off a bit, sort of take a bird's eye view of this so we can see what the problematic is here. I conceive of it as a sort of competition between the first person point of view and science. Here comes science, juggernaut, rolling down the rails, making lots of progress, studying the brain and everything. And then there's the lone, brave person saying, wait a minute, I know a truth that I derive from my own consciousness, which you science folks can't account for. There is at least one truth over and above the scientific truth, and it's the one that I get from my first person point of view. Now, we're familiar with that in Jackson's Mary example and in many other confrontations. And what Dirk's hypothesis is to say to the first person who utters this challenge, hang on, it may be that those properties actually lack such features, that your introspective conviction may just be a mistake. It may not be accurate, in which case the whole challenge to physicalism is more or less dissolves. Now, Dirk thinks that this is possible. He's very cautious about this. He thinks it's possible that, let me make sure I get it right here, that phenomenal properties don't have some of the features that introspection tells us they do have, which features are presumably a challenge, an impossible to meet challenge for science, for physicalism. So he thinks it's possible, and he uses the example just to sort of loosen you up of how wrong we can be about color properties of color vision. It turns out that colors aren't at all what we introspectively or natively or naively think they are. They don't, surfaces don't have the properties that you might think they had on the basis of naive color vision. And the parallel claim, as I understand it, is, and your own phenomenal, we can iterate this inside, in effect, your own phenomenal states may not have the properties it seems to you flat obvious they do have, which you know by introspection. So your introspection may be just as wrong about your internal phenomenal properties as your color perceptions or your naive color views are wrong about the nature of regularities in the outside world. Now, he says he thinks this is possible. I think it's bloody obviously true. I think that if there's one thing we know very clearly from science, it is that we're often just wrong about things that seem introspectively very certain. Now, I also agree, however, that what science shows us is counterintuitive. And that's important because, well, for reasons that we'll see in a minute. Now, thinking this over in preparation for this, I came to realize that it may well be that the weaker thesis, Dirk's thesis, makes for a stronger claim. If you think of it this way, here's the physicalists say, we can explain it all. And David Thomas say, no, you can't. And then we come back, oh, yes, we can. Cannot, yes, we can. And you get this back and forth. And he comes along and says, hang on, you're both overstating the case. Don't you both recognize it is at least possible that you can't? That, in other words, that David's conviction that his introspection delivers truths about phenomenal properties, that might just be a mistake. He's not saying it is. I'm saying it is. Dirk's not saying that. He's had much more modest claim, just that it's possible. And of course, if it's possible, then the argument against physicalism is going to unravel in any case, because now we don't have the sort of lead pipe certainty that you'd need to push through the sort of revolution in science that's called for. At any rate, that's the way I'm reading it. If that's not quite what he had in mind, that's what I was getting out of it. Now, his method, I said I was going to compare our methods. His method is, now when I put this list up, I don't mean to say that my method is the opposite. I just want to highlight certain features of his method. It's meticulous. I am very impressed with the care he takes at formulating his claims. It's clear as a bell. You have to work at it because it's not always the most poetic prose in the world. But if you struggle, there's some parsings there which had my eyes in a twist. But I got through them in the end. It's, as I said already, it's cautious. It's respectful. He respects views. I felt myself chastised when I saw that he was respecting views that I found hard to respect, like, say, agent causation. And it's honest. When he doesn't know something, he says he doesn't know it. And I think all of this sets a really good example. And I felt, as I say, somewhat chastised, actually, reading and thinking, well, am I always as careful as I should be about some of these matters? But, you knew there was a but coming. It seems to me that your method also, in a way, suffers a little bit from sort of tunnel vision, in that you more or less deliberately tie your hands behind your back and say, I'm not using any science. I'm not going to rely on science at all. And fair enough, that's a tactical decision, but I think you pay a price. Now, here's my acid test for this. This could be others, but I was thinking, okay, which method is better? Well, look, for years I've tried in vain to persuade David that physicalism withstands his arguments. Absolutely without success. I have completely failed to convince Dave. Now, if Dirk's arguments persuade Dave, then I take my hat off to him. I say, okay, man, you got a great method. So Dave, your response to this is really, I will be listening very carefully, because, you know, if you roll over and say, dang, you got me, Dirk, then I will know that I should have been doing it his way all this time. Okay. I'm not holding my breath. Now, what's happening? Okay. And of course, it's like the Turing test. It's a one-way test. Failing it proves nothing. If David doesn't concede, it doesn't show that Dirk is wrong or that his method is bad. It's just maybe too hard a test for any theory to pass. Okay. That's all I'm going to say about consciousness. I'm sure he'll have a lot more to say. About 10 minutes. Okay. Now, his optimistic skepticism about free will runs like this. Maybe determinism isn't true. That's the skepticism part. But even if it is, and if it rules out one kind of free will, the kind of free will that supports what he calls basic desert, then he says this, I think, very nice phrase, conceiving of life without this type of free will would not be the devastating to morality or to our sense of the meaning of life, and in certain respects it may even be beneficial. I think, bingo, I think that's right. I'm very happy with that. So what's basic desert? This is what determinism is incompatible with, and it's with the kind of moral responsibility that grounds basic desert. One deserves praise or blame not by virtue of consequentialist or contractarian considerations. In other words, Dirk is setting aside, for the sake of argument, any account of desert which is contractarian or utilitarian or consequentialist, saying, I guess because that's not basic and maybe it's not even properly desert, he's going for the nugget, basic desert, which is the grounds for instance, retributive punishment. He says it's presupposed by Strawson's reactive attitudes. I thought about that for a while, and I think you're right. And I think that's another reason to be dubious of Strawson on reactive attitudes. Okay. Now, I think that basic desert is a cruel myth. And I think it is undeserving of the respect it is usually paid, including the respect in general, which I applaud, of Dirk. I think this idea that there's a sort of guilty in the eyes of God type of responsibility, that where you are cosmically deserving of your fate, I think that is an inflation of an idea, and it's a dangerous inflation, I think, because it pumps up the ideas of morality to an unsustainable and fragile brittleness, which they neither need, they can't sustain, and they don't need. And here I think Dirk and I agree. You can have a good sense of moral responsibility. It's not basic desert. You can have, there's varieties of free will that are worth wanting, that give you the meaning of life without having this basic desert. We agree that abandoning the idea does not lead to nihilism and amorality. Once again, perhaps the weaker thesis makes the stronger argument. I am prepared to swing with the idea that I should abandon my diatribes against the whole notion of basic desert, let the libertarians have their notion of basic desert, and say, yeah, and we're going to have to give it up, but it's not so bad. Whereas I say, good riddance. He says, it's not so bad. We can live without Now, I don't have an acid test for this one, but if somebody knows one, you can suggest it. Now, what we don't agree on, we agreed then on quite a lot. Our position on free will is quite similar, and so is our position on consciousness in some ways. The main difference, I think, we may have a better idea, is we differ about the notion of moral responsibility and the role of punishment. I think that there is a perfectly available, sustainable, and defensible rationale for punishment which isn't retributive. And it's contractarian, it's social. And that this is the basis for our understanding of morality. But that's another story, that's me, that's not him. We'll leave that for another day, because one more point I want to make is I don't see how Dirk and others, such as, say, Bruce Waller, how they, given their views of moral responsibility, how they can justify, for instance, taking into custody. That is, if we're giving up moral responsibility in one sense, are we also giving up the notion of culpability, which is used to justify, say, putting somebody under restraint, whether or not they're, it's sort of cold comfort. You say, well, you can't punish them, but you can put them in handcuffs for 10 years. Oh, and that isn't punishment? What's going to justify taking into custody unless you have some notion, or can you take anybody into custody who's a sort of a bother to society? Or are there some culpability requirements on that? I think there are, and that they're defensible. And the thought experiment, the toy problem I like to use to illustrate that is penalties in sport. If you really don't believe in basic desert, then it seems to me you've got to go across the board. That means you don't believe in basic desert when it comes to sports either, which means nobody ever deserves a red card. Nobody ever deserves to be put in the penalty box. Nobody ever deserves an infraction for dangerous play or anything like that. Why? Because, you know, determinism is true and nobody ever deserves anything. I think the rationale which justifies having rules in games which have penalties attached to them, they're not retributive. You're not doing this to educate or reform the player. You're doing it to punish the player or the player's team, and it's okay. So I don't think you can have even a justification for the rules of sport without a fairly robust notion of responsibility. Now, Dirk's caution, back to that very briefly, almost all my thing. He thinks agent causation, quote, is not credible given our best physical theories. I think that's true. But he says it's not been ruled out as a coherent possibility. Well, maybe, I agree. But boy, oh boy. I think it's pretty much a non-starter. But anyway, I'm ready to go along with your caution there. So now, by not relying on science, Dirk has a rather narrow base from which to build, and that's intuition. I would say that's not only narrow, it's also somewhat unreliable. And interestingly here is that Dirk, I think, agrees that intuition is not the ultra-reliable fountain of truth that a lot of people think it is. And he says again and again, he notes that intuition only gives you a sort of prima facie case. Here, look at, I just pulled a few quotes. It is at least at first intuitive for many of us that. Consider first the initially plausible proposal. It seems initially plausible that Mary cannot derive. For many, it seems at least initially reasonable to conjecture that consciousness is not a fundamental property, phenomenon. And then in free will, intuitively it does render him This is Plum and his thought experiment. Non-responsible. A few more. Intuition, it remains intuitive. Well, Dirk likes to use intuition pumps, as I do, and what I like about his intuition pump, the latest one, is that it comes in 4 varieties. He's turning the knobs on the intuition pump. He gives us 4 cases. I'm not going to go through the tax cut example because I'm already at the edge of my time. A Plum kills White example, and there's 4 different conditions. In the first condition, it's nefarious neuroscientists who are tweaking Plum's brain. In the second case, it's nefarious developmental neuroscientists that tweaked Plum, you know, in embryo or something like that. In the third case, it's sort of brainwashing in youth, and in the fourth case, it's just normal. Determinism holds, but Plum's biography is normal. And here's what Dirk says about these. Well, I say he should turn more knobs. Here's what he says about them. He says the best explanation for why the agent isn't responsible in these 4 cases is that he's causally determined by factors beyond his control in each. I don't think I'm not persuaded by that at all. I don't think that's the best explanation. I think the best explanation is unrecognized manipulation is the best explanation, not causal determination. In the first 2 cases, in first 3 cases really, the person's been manipulated by agents for reasons good or bad in ways that the agent doesn't recognize. And I think that's what diminishes the responsibility. I have my own thought experiment quartet that is supposed to show that, but I don't think I'll spend time on it now. If we need it, we'll come to it later. Okay. Punchline. Since Dirk and I agree on bottom lines to some degree, what I would like to see from him or from Dave and from others here too, speaking really to all of you, is I would like to see a full-throated defense of their method, their meticulous a prioristic method, based on intuitions. Not just this is the only way I can address these issues that they will listen to, but in a more constructive way. What do we learn? What have we ever learned from philosophy done with that method? I know it well. I was raised on it. I remember I am, after all, the one who defined the verb to chisel. To chisel away, you start with definition D1 and you end up with definition D8 prime, and you keep going back and forth with counterexamples and more counterexamples. And those exercises in definition have not, I think, ever been fruitful. But I am only too happy to be shown otherwise. Thank you. I went on a little too long. You can all do better than me. Your turn, Perry.
Great. Thank you very much.